You may have seen videos like this before where hackers take control of a computer screen and type away at it, manipulating data and information to their own ends. But how often does this kind of thing really happen? You might think that it's mostly Hollywood fantasy or a sci-fi trope. However, one country found out just how real it is when a series of hacks completely shut down their entire electrical grid. This is how a hack took down a whole country's lights. On December 23, 2015, around 6 a.m. local time in Ukraine, something strange happened. A number of people living in western Ukraine noticed their lights had gone out and assumed it was another power cut. Little did they know this would be the last thing they saw for the next 6 days. It turned out that an attack had been launched against the nation's electrical infrastructure, and by the time everything was said and done, 230,000 people would be affected. This was a full-blown blackout. The worst part was that this wasn't some random act of God or accident. Rather, it was a fully coordinated and highly sophisticated attack, which saw hackers completely take control of the country's power grid. What's scary is that this isn't exactly a modern example either. In fact, it happened almost 8 years ago now, and since then, similar threats have only grown. So what actually happened back in December of 2015? How could a few people take down an entire nation's power supply? And what can we expect in the future? Well, the first attacks happened a few months prior to the blackout. In September and October of 2015, malware was injected into the Ukrainian power grid, giving hackers remote access to the system. Then for 3 long months, the hackers lay low and waited. Finally, in December, they made their move. When they struck at 6 a.m., they already knew the power stations would be understaffed and most engineers would be asleep. This gave them a significant advantage. The blackout affected for different regions and several cities, including the capital of Kiev. For the first hour, no one knew what had happened. All the computers in the control rooms were completely fried. Even after they powered them back on, nothing showed up on the screens. It was as if the systems had never been there at all. What was going on? It turned out that the hackers had hacked into the UPS devices used by the control rooms. A UPS is an uninterruptible power supply which keeps a computer running during a blackout by taking over as soon as the main power source cuts out. These are vital for ensuring that the control rooms can continue operating even during a power cut, so that the technicians can restore power as quickly as possible. It's literally their safeguard against blackouts. Except the hackers had anticipated this and sabotaged it. They reprogrammed the UPS devices to fail during an outage, meaning that even though the technicians knew something was wrong, they couldn't get the backup systems to activate. It was as if someone had flipped a switch in the real world and disabled all the circuit breakers. The blackout continued for hours and nobody knew why. In fact, the blackout wouldn't end up being fixed for 6 days. This was no accident. The hackers didn't just want to cause a blackout, they wanted to blind the operators completely and make it look like a random event so they could figure out what was going on. The company that runs the grid, the energy minister and the government were all caught off guard. They had no idea what had happened. When the blackout first started, technicians tried switching things back on at the main substations. But when they couldn't access the control panels, they had no choice but to wait until the problem was fixed from the other side. Eventually, when they gained access to the system, they discovered the extent of the damage. It was a nightmare. Computers were completely wiped. Connections were severed and multiple systems had been disabled. It was a true disaster. However, once they figured out what was happening, the technicians worked around the clock to fix the problem. Meanwhile, investigators set about figuring out who was responsible for this audacious attack. It was later found that the hackers had exploited weaknesses in older Soviet-era equipment which had been properly maintained. They used the malware to target remote terminal units which regulate the flow of electricity. These are TIAS control things like switches and circuit breakers, and the hackers used them to bring the grid to its knees. But behind the scenes, the whole attack was orchestrated by hacking into the main control systems. 5 main commands were sent to the RTS, each one sabotaging a different aspect of the power grid until finally plunging the whole country into darkness. At one point, the malware even caused the fire alarm in one of the substations to go off, probably to distract the workers. It was a brilliant plan that executed perfectly. Even scarier is that it might have just been a dress rehearsal. Many experts believe that Russia was behind the attack, although this was never confirmed. The timing was suspicious. Just 2 weeks prior to the blackout, Ukraine and the European Union had announced plans to connect the nation's power grid to the EU grid. If successful, this would have allowed Ukraine to import much-needed energy from neighboring countries. Russia obviously wasn't happy about this, and although no one can say for sure if they were behind the blackout, it seems pretty clear that they were trying to send a message. Ukraine is heavily reliant on Russian natural gas, importing around 80% of their total requirements from their eastern neighbor. By taking out a huge portion of their power grid, Russia showed that they were capable of doing far more damage than that. They could completely plunge the country into darkness and chaos. And the timing of the blackout, right before Ukraine was about to secure alternative energy supplies, made it clear that this wasn't a random event. It was a deliberate act of aggression meant to send a message. Since this attack, many concerns have been raised about the security of the nation's critical infrastructure. With the Cold War coming to an end and Russia becoming more aggressive on the world stage, it's clear that the old Soviet-era equipment needs to be upgraded. Otherwise, the country could find itself plunged into darkness at the worst possible moment. After the blackout, Ukraine took steps to protect their infrastructure from future attacks. Firewall software was installed on vulnerable systems and remote access was limited to essential personnel only. However, similar incidents have been reported in other countries, showing that this kind of thing isn't unique to Ukraine. For example, in 2016, the Ukrainian power grid was hit again by a malware called Black Energy 3. Once again, the malware spread through remote access Trojans, which allowed hackers to infiltrate the system and bring parts of the grid offline. Luckily, this time the damage was limited thanks to the upgrades made after the previous attack, but it showed that the hackers were learning and adapting. They weren't going to be deterred by the extra security measures. And it's not just Ukraine that's at risk either. Other countries, especially those with aging infrastructure, are also vulnerable. In 2017, for example, a nuclear power plant in Sweden was hacked. While the plant wasn't taken offline, the fact that a nuclear reactor was targeted was alarming. Who knows what could have happened if the attackers had been more malicious. So what should we expect moving forward? Well, as our infrastructure gets older and more interconnected, the threat of cyber attacks will only grow. We need to take steps to protect ourselves from these threats, both physically and digitally. Otherwise, we could find ourselves in a world where the lights go out and no one knows why. What do you think? Is it possible to take down an entire country's power supply with a simple hack? Or was this just a case of bad luck? Let me know in the comments below, and if you enjoyed this video, be sure to check out my other content. Thanks for watching.